All right, so this is a continuation from class of the Models of Economic Development lecture. And so the video lecture is going to start, as we've already talked in class about the self-sufficiency model of economic development. We're going to talk about why countries have abandoned this type of model and gone to what we call the international trade approach. Probably the greatest downfall to this system is inefficiency. Whereas systems like capitalism demand efficiency, they demand high quality goods and services. The problem with this system is that when you have protected industries that are heavily subsidized, those industries don't have the motivation to do better. If you protect your industries with such high tariffs, they don't have to face foreign competition. And so the domestic producers of whatever it is, they're going to produce something that is cheap to them, that is probably of mediocre quality, and so this is a real problem for this kind of an economy. The next one: if consumers know that they cannot get good quality goods, they're eventually going to figure out how to way to get that, and so you're going to get the emergence of a black market. And black market just means a legal trade of some kind. You're going to be getting some sort of informal economy develop where it's not regulated by the government. And people are, they're going to find the ways to get quality goods or illegal goods or something anyways. Thirdly, because we, as a goal, as an economy under this type of system, want zero unemployment, that means everybody gets a job. So even, lazy people, they know that probably they cannot get fired because the government's requiring them to stay employed. So what's your motivation if you know that no matter what you do, you're going to get paid? You're going to get a guy working in a job that looks like the guy in the bottom right-hand corner. Next, because you want zero unemployment, you're going to have a lot of people working for the government, whereas in capitalism or international trade, you're going to get times where unemployment spikes up. You're going to get times where people just aren't hiring. Whereas in this type of system, the government wants to always maintain zero unemployment. And so you're going to get a lot of people that work for the government, and they may not be doing a whole lot. And a lot of that is just paid for by tax dollars. And this hurts the wealthy people, especially the most. Inevitably, this system leads to corruption. An example that I used in one of my classes, let's just say that you have a meat inspector, and that meat inspector is going to go into a meat packing plant and make sure that they are being clean and using sanitary practices. And so let's say I go in there as a meat inspector, and remember that because I'm part of such a large bureaucracy, I probably don't get paid a ton of money. And I go into this meat packing plant, I find all these violations, and the owner of the meat packing plant says, "Hey, look, buddy, you don't make a lot of money. Why don't I give you $10,000 and you just sort of look the other way and don't write me up?" And when people aren't making a bunch of money, there's a greater chance for corruption to happen. So these are some of the major issues facing economies that are self-sufficient. And like I said, people need motivation. They need competition to make them better. Consumers demand better. And this type of system doesn't lead to that, and it doesn't lead to a lot of economic growth, and people kind of demand that. All right, so what's their alternative? Their alternative is the international trade approach, or kind of the international model of economic development. And when we think of this type of a system, probably what comes to mind is something that resembles capitalism or the system that we use, where our economy is, not only active in producing goods here, but we sell goods to the rest of the world. We import goods from the rest of the world. And then we're also making goods for Americans, like out there in the world. So this is a big kind of shift away from insulating ourselves from that kind of self-sufficient type attitude. And so, if you are a country that wants to kind of do this, there's a couple of things you have to do. So one of them is that you have to, as a country, sort of identify what is it that you have that the rest of the world either doesn't have enough of or doesn't have at all. Because whatever you exploit and whatever you're going to try to generate wealth off of, it's got to be complementary to the world market. And so what I mean by that, and really when we look at kind of like what a definition of complementarity is that let's say that you have oil. Well, what kind of countries are you going to sell your oil to? You're not going to sell countries that also produce oil. You're going to sell your oil to countries that either don't have enough oil or they don't produce oil at all. And so when you have that complementarity, then you can generate wealth off of that particular resource or whatever that asset is. Now, kind of going along with that idea, if let's just say, and this is inevitably going to happen, whatever it is that you produce that you're going to try to generate wealth off of, what's going to happen when that resource or that good that you produce, there's other countries that sell the same thing. Okay. So what you have to do is you have to identify and try to create what's called a comparative advantage. Now, one of the things that I try to explain a comparative advantage is here in a few years, you guys are going to be applying for a job and there's going to be other people that apply for the same job. Why would that employer employ you? Like, what is it about you that makes you better? And when you identify that, maybe you have a more outgoing personality, maybe you're good at working with difficult people. Maybe you have good math skills and so you can work at cash register, whatever the case may be, right? That is your comparative advantage compared to the people that are also trying to get the same job. Well, now if we go in a broad sense and we think about a country, if you have 5 countries making coffee, well, what is it about your coffee that makes your coffee better? Is your coffee cheaper? Is your coffee of higher quality? Is your coffee nice and smooth or whatever it is? It doesn't have to be coffee, but like in the case of Saudi Arabia, as they produced oil, there's a lot of countries that produce oil, but they have so big of a supply of it that they can sell it for a low cost. And so that's their comparative advantage. All right, then next, once you start generating wealth off of your exploitable asset or assets, now as a country, you need to be smart about what you do with that wealth. So if you have a couple of major industries that start producing money, lots of employees that are making money, now you can tax those people. What are you going to do with your money if you're a country that is smart, that's going to sort of pay it forward into the next generation of your country so that the next generation lives more comfortably than the first or than the current generation? And so what a really good idea for countries to do as they're exploiting their asset is to invest in things like education, right? So in China right now, you have people that are working in these factories, but their kids are starting to go to school. And so by the time that they get out of their education system, well, now those kids have productive skills, they have computer literacy, maybe they speak a couple different languages, and now they'll never work in a factory. All right. So it's important that you invest in things like education or infrastructure. You want your infant mortality rate to go down. You want your literacy rate, your life expectancy to go up. How can you do that? Well, you can invest in things like sewer systems, clean drinking water, filtration systems, so that your people are not dying of cholera or dysentery or something like that. So invest in electricity lines, in dams, so that you can create reservoirs, so that you can you can have productive agriculture. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with this money that would be smart in terms of the overall development of your country. Okay. So we kind of have a game plan for how to do this in like a sort of a progression, if you will, of development under the international trade model. And the geographer that kind of created an outline for this was a guy by the name of Walt Rostow. And so we kind of call this Rostow's model of development. And Rostow's development model says that there's going to be 5 distinct stages that a country goes through using the international trade approach in order to kind of go develop from beginning to end. And every MDC that's an MDC today, they have gone through some version of Rostow's model of development. All right, so Rostow says at the beginning, there's what he calls a traditional society. So in the traditional society, you want to think of this, as you kind of write down some things about each one of these stages, which I would advise you to do. In the traditional society, this is pre-industrial. Okay, so this is Most people are at basic hunter gatherers, but probably they're agriculturalists. There's very few services. They're very basic services. The vast majority of your people are engaged in primary economic activity. Okay. And you might even have some non-productive industries, like people that are part of the military. Even though the military is necessary, like how do they generate wealth? So that's the traditional society. Now, if you are going to industrialize, if you're going to take off, as Rostow calls it, then there needs to be some sort of preconditions for takeoff. And some hallmarks of stage number 2 in Rostow's development model are going to be things like you need a visionary leadership. And so whether that's one person like a king or something like that, or whether it's like a group, or maybe it's just a couple of smart individuals, whatever the case may be, those visionaries, they need to have some sort of direction that they want to take the economy, and they need to know how to get there. Now, going along with that, in order for them to be able to do that, they have to set up your economy in a way that puts you into the best position to exploit your assets that you have. And so we're just going to use Saudi Arabia. And, if we're going to be able to exploit the oil that we have, a lot of that oil is out in the desert. Okay, well, how are you going to get it from the desert to the coast? You're going to need pipelines. You're going to need roads. You're going to need ports that are equipped to handle big oil tankers and be able to transfer that oil from a pipeline to a tanker. And so it's the job of you as the government, or you as the leader of the economy, to make sure that those things are in place, that you have the necessary infrastructure, that you have the things that industry requires for them to be able to exploit it. Okay, and so those are what we call preconditions for takeoff. Okay, then you take off. And really, I think we could probably just make a synonym for takeoff with you industrialize. Your economy starts to grow. And really what you're doing here is you've got this asset or these assets. You've got these raw materials. Maybe it's cotton, maybe it's gold, maybe it's oil, whatever the case may be. You are now exploiting them. You are now being able to generate wealth off of them by selling them to the international community, to other countries. And so this helps your economy to grow. Now, initially, when you take off, you're probably only going to have a couple of major industries. Heck, you may even have just one, but you're going to have no more than just a couple. In other words, what I'm saying is your economy is not very diversified. Your primary sector does start to shrink, your secondary sector does start to grow, and your tertiary sector starts to grow, but it's still small at this point. All right, and then Rostow says you go through a fourth stage called the drive to maturity. So now you're talking about an economy where industrialization has been going on for 30, 40, 50 years. And you're starting to see a little bit more diversity in that economy. Whereas before you had one or two major industries, now maybe you have 5 or 10. Your primary sector continues to shrink. Your secondary sector is kind of topping out. And then your tertiary sector is over 50% of the people. But that's really kind of your drive to maturity. But what you should be noticing is that the nature of your economy is beginning to change. And it's changed for sure once you get to stage 5, which is called the age of mass consumption. The highlight or the key part of the age of mass consumption is now your economy is driven on what you consume and not by as much what you produce. Whereas in industrialization, it's all about taking our raw materials, transforming them into something valuable and selling them. Now it's all about getting cheap goods. And a lot of times we get those cheap goods from out in the world somewhere, but it's how we exploit them. And that's really what we mean by the age of mass consumption. Is it's an age of services. Okay. Our economy is driven by services. Our economy is driven by spending and consumption. And if you think about some of our biggest companies that we have in the world, and really in the United States for that matter, think about like Amazon and Walmart. What do they produce? Like, what do they make? And if you think about it, the answer is really nothing. They just sell goods. They sell already made goods, and they make a lot of money doing that. And so our economy is driven by us consuming. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that we don't produce anything, because we still do. In fact, the United States, from a dollar perspective, we make just as much as anybody in the world. But it's the type of things that we make that's the distinction. So another hallmark of the age of mass consumption is the type of manufacturing that a country like us is going to do. And that's what we call high value added manufacturing. Whereas like textiles or clothing, that's low value added. Whatever the raw material is and whatever you transform it into, there's not a lot of difference from the value of the raw material to the finished good. But in the age of mass consumption, countries are focusing on ones that generate the most wealth. So we take raw materials, we turn it into something very highly, it has a lot of value added, like a computer chip. Okay. And that's what we focus on. So, like the United States focuses on producing things that make a lot of money, right? Computer technology, airplanes, military technology, gene therapy, those kind of things. Those are highly valued goods or services, and that's what we focus on in the age of mass consumption. Okay, so last thing here, we should be thinking in the age of mass consumption, really tiny primary sector. We have a shrinking secondary sector. Remember, we talked about this in class where we're outsourcing a lot of our low value added stuff. And so we've lost a lot of employment in the secondary sector. We've got robots and machines, making vehicles and things like that. So we just don't need as many people working in factories. But that's also because by now our government has put enough money in public education that you're overqualified to work in a factory. And so you're going to be working in a service which is easier on your body and makes money. So we're going to see in stage 5 that we've got a lot of people working in the tertiary sector. And this is what, I kind of put this visually, but this is what we talked about. Saudi Arabia, they had to build these pipelines to the coast. They created a situation where they could take off, and then they started exploiting their oil, and they were smart. They put it into making sure that there were good wide highways and cleanliness of the city and proper transportation. So you got to be smart when you start making start making money off your, in this case, oil. Reinvest it in your country and pay it forward so that your economy does better in the future. Okay, next concept, the core periphery model. And we'll talk about kind of core periphery model and how uneven development works with it. But the core periphery model is this idea that there is a group of countries that we call the core, otherwise known as MDCs. And the way that they have gotten wealthy and continue to get wealthy at a very fast pace is by exploiting the countries that are less wealthy, that are less productive, that are less educated. And what this leads to is something called uneven development. Okay. And so if you look at the countries within the red line, those are, like North America, most of the Western European countries, Japan, Australia certainly fits into this, but those countries make up the core. And outside of this is what geographers call the periphery. So you just know the peripheries as the LDCs. All right, the MDCs have gotten rich off of them by exploiting their natural resources. We saw this in the case of Africa for the Europeans. It could be, cheap labor like the United States has done to China. Interest from loans like the World Bank, which is the financial arm of the United Nations. Most of the money that goes out in the form of loans from the World Bank comes from MDCs like the United States or the United Kingdom or Germany. And then they give those loans out so that these LDCs can develop and exploit their assets. But in doing so, they have to pay these ginormous loans back plus interest. And so the MDCs kind of, they get richer. Also immigration. So remember that if I am in one of these periphery countries and I'm a reasonably intelligent person, I know that if I go to a core country, I can probably get paid better for my skills. And so we have that brain drain. So that's another form of MDC, exploitation. Now we need to realize that all of these countries in the periphery, they are industrializing and their standard of living is growing, albeit slowly. So they are growing, but because of this core periphery model and idea, there's uneven development. In other words, the MDCs are growing at a much faster pace their economies are getting much larger, much faster compared to these countries that are beginning to go through industrialization. Um, and so a good example of uneven development would be, I don't know, the United States and El Salvador. El Salvador is growing; they're growing slowly, but the United States, we have exploited El Salvador for sugar plantations, coffee plantations, things like that. And, we're the countries that kind of get rich off of that by then taking that cheap coffee and selling it at Starbucks and things like that. Okay, so that's the core periphery model. Now, this system is not stagnant. You can be a periphery country and you can move into the core, and we've got evidence of that. Japan, after World War II, their economy was in shambles, and then we kind of went in and we taught them how to make electronics and cars, and by the 1980s, they were making them better than us. And so, then Japan moved into the core. Well, in the last 20, 30 years, we see this with the 4 Asian tigers or 4 Asian dragons. And so they are, East and kind of Southeast Asia's version of countries that were in the periphery and now have kind of moved their way into the core. And a good example of this would be Hong Kong. Hong Kong moved into the core by being a financial trade center, so international banking. Singapore did it by being kind of a center hub for trade in South Asia. They're located very well at the Strait of Malacca. Taiwan and South Korea, they did it through the outsourcing of things like textiles and electronics by countries like the United States, excuse me. And so, but they did it, and they were exploited for probably 20, 30, 40 years, and now they're countries that are exploiting other countries. All right, last thing, finishing up here. What are problems with the international trade alternative compared to self-sufficiency? One of them is uneven resource distribution. Not everybody has oil like Saudi Arabia or the natural resources that a country like the United States has. What if the best thing that your country has to exploit is, I don't know, coffee or bananas? Your economy is going to have a tough time really taking off. So some of the places around the world, they're just not blessed with that many natural resources or exploitable assets. Okay, second thing, and I'm just going to use coffee again because it makes a good example, but what happens with you have this year where your climate's really good and you have lots of production, but so does everybody else along the equator that grows coffee. And so now they've flooded the market with a bunch of coffee beans. Think about what that's going to do to the price of coffee beans. It's going to bring it way down. And so if you have market stagnation, you've produced a lot, you've got a lot of costs you got to cover, you need a lot of that to sell, but if the prices are low, it's going to be more difficult for you to pay your costs. So market stagnation can be a real problem in this style of economy. Thirdly, if let's say I am a coffee farmer, right, and I want to get a tractor, I want to get modern machinery so I can, work less hard and produce more. Where am I going to get a tractor from? Where am I going to get complex irrigation systems from? Where am I going to get herbicide and pesticide? And the answer is I'm going to have to get them from an MDC. Let's think about it from a kind of a macro perspective. Now I'm a country and I have an exploitable resource, but I don't have the money to lay the infrastructure to start exploiting it. I need a loan. I need a loan from the World Bank. And remember, who are the countries that kind of control and put the majority of the money into the World Bank for that loan? And again, that's the MDCs. So we see that if you're an LDC, the MDCs hold a lot of advantages and they can exploit you in a lot of different ways. Cultural costs. By what you're doing or how you're changing your economy, how is that going to impact your culture? Is that going to, you might be a rural people and now this is your takeoff is going to cause massive urbanization. And if your economy grows, maybe that's going to attract immigrants to come in. And now all of a sudden, that's going to threaten cultures and cultures may be mixing and stuff like that. So, whether that's a positive or negative, it is going to probably impact your culture by developing. And then lastly, the environmental costs. And this one's kind of easy to see. We'll use coal for an example. Let's say that I want to produce electricity for my people. And I've got to burn coal to power my power plant. That coal is very dirty. When I burn it, it produces soot and bad stuff for the environment, for the air, and that can cause things like acid rain. So, even though a lot of pretty much every country in the world besides two have chosen to use this international trade approach, There are some negative things that come with it, and it's not always good. But by and large, countries, over a 50 or 100-year period, their standard of living goes way up. Their disposable time goes up. Their access to technology, their life just becomes easier and more comfortable. And so that's why these countries choose the international trade approach. Okay, so those are the main points about the models of development. Thank you for tuning in today.